Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel for the next part of my Solomon's campaign for Fire in the Sky. Before I say anything else, I just wanted to offer up a huge thank you to all of you who've taken the trouble to comment on the last video. I really appreciate that. I regret I haven't had a chance to read through and properly prepare answers to your communications yet, but I hope to do so before the weekend ends. It's just that, as ever, with the busyness of life and everything else, and the depredations of a certain cat, I'm keen to just crack on with finishing the videos for this series. So we'll press on with what remains of turn one and the allied side of the turn. But before I do that, a couple of housekeeping items that I need to pick up on from the previous video. The first of these concerns the Japanese carriers Junyo and Hiyo, which arrived as reinforcements. Now, as I decided I was going to play with all of the optional rules, I put them in the carriers without planes box, and I committed the aircraft arriving the same turn to be trained as carrier pilots. Now, the problem I've noticed is carrier pilots that are trained in this manner, as per the optional rules, need a year to complete their training, which means that these aircraft would not be available until after the scenario ended, which is a bit of a problem. Now, this is completely ahistorical because, of course, Junyo and Hiyo were active through most of the Solomon's campaign, and it would effectively deprive the Japanese side of these carriers. I also thought I'd put them in for game balance because, with all apologies to the US Navy, who put up a brilliant fight on turn one and deprived the Japanese of their most formidable carriers right at the outset of the campaign, it does leave the Japanese badly hobbled, and it might make for a rather uninteresting game. Whereas if Junyo and Hiyo are present and have a full complement of aircraft, then it gives the Japanese a fighting chance. So I have ruled that they can join the fleet from this turn with their full aircraft complement. But to keep things fair, because I realise I'm doing the Japanese a massive favour here, the aircraft which should have arrived as reinforcements and which I'd committed to carrier pilot training are just going straight out of play. The Japanese get no further benefit from them. So that was the first thing. Let me just send these guys northwards to join the combined fleet. The other thing was the sad fate of poor Colonel Ichiki and his brave men. Now, during the battle, when their transports were hit by US air attack, no, submarine attack, apologies, I was babbling on about having to withdraw them because of the damage they'd taken. What I had forgotten was that when land units are on board vulnerable transports, it's not a matter of inflicting hits up to their combat strength. Each hit equal to their depleted combat strength is what gets rid of them. Now, they took enough submarine hits to sink them outright. So while I was talking about withdrawing the unit, they had in fact already withdrawn, that is, to the bottom of the sea. So thankfully it had no impact on what happens in the game, because when a land unit is destroyed, whether that's at sea or on land, it reappears as a reinforcement 2 game turns later. So no harm done there. But if I caused any bewilderment with that error, sorry about that. So here we are back in the sunny Solomons, and it's the United States' turn. So the first thing that happens is the economic warfare option. Are the United States going to do anything about cutting Japan's logistical support? Well, I'm afraid for this turn they can't, because they are not within range, and they certainly do not have the capability to strategically bomb the home islands this turn. And also, the price of their stunning tactical success in the battle earlier this turn is that they have used up all of their submarine points, so they're not going to be torpedoing any Japanese merchantmen. The only consolation they have is that when Ichiki and his men were sunk, the very act of sinking that force knocked 2 merchantman pool points off the Japanese total. So the economic warfare turn is going to be a very quiet one for the United States. However, things are looking happier when it comes to their reinforcements. No more carriers, but they get a fairly substantial naval reinforcement. The modern battleships North Carolina and Washington, and a big bunch of destroyers. So they will go over here. And at the same time, all the other ships that took part in the battles earlier in the turn can benefit from the free transfer ability to go from the US West Coast to Pearl Harbor. So Pearl Harbor's looking like a fairly healthy place right now. And that is not the end of the US reinforcements. Their transport points are set back to 16. They get back their 2 submarine points. And they get an 8 combat strength land unit. That's fairly substantial. So it's looking like it's going to be trouble for the Japanese, because the US have got some rather massive reinforcements this turn. Now, what they'll decide to do with them is anybody's guess, but it is a substantial increase in strength. So let me just check I've got that right on the reinforcement chart. Turn 4. Yes, 1 8 combat strength land unit. So I'll just pick on the 8th Army for now. I may as well. And they will also free transfer to, or will they? Actually, no. They can't fit in Pearl Harbor at the moment because the 2nd Marine Division is there. Yes, let me just double check the stacking limit. I'm pretty sure they can't fit, but it's best to be certain. Yes, 8 transport factors. So the big US Army formation will have to wait until the US Marines have cleared out the way. Okay, so what about first deployment? Now, looking at the situation in the Solomons, the Allies don't have that many options. They were really triumphant the previous turn. They'd fought off a major Japanese offensive. But when we look at the defenders of Port Moresby, it's a weak Australian brigade with an air unit. There are substantial Japanese ground forces to the north, so I think any kind of redeployment or advance of forces out of there would not be a good idea. The Marines on Guadalcanal are very obviously staying where they are. However, it is worth a 1 hex deployment of the air assets in Espiritu Santo to Henderson Field. So the US now has a complete air garrison in place on Guadalcanal, which is well worth having. Now, Guadalcanal at the moment can't accommodate much more aircraft than that. But I am wondering if it is worth the United States' while to bring in reinforcements from the Ellis Islands. Certainly those aircraft could do more good over in the theatre. So That's 2 transport factors. They'll have to go the long way because of the Japanese air zone of control. So let's say they go 1, 2, 3 and stop there for the first leg of the journey. And then go 1, 2, 3, going around the Japanese air zone of control so that they can get to Port Moresby and beef up the air defences there. So now Port Moresby is fully stocked with aircraft, and the Allies now have a significant air advantage in terms of numbers over the 4 strength points that occupy the base at Rabaul. So that's quite a healthy move to make. I just need to deduct the transport points for that. So that was 2 sea deployments for the air unit. So that is a total of 2 transport points. So I'll deduct that from the US. I think we'll leave the 21st Regiment in place at Ellis Island. I don't think the Japanese will try anything, but equally, it would be a bit ahistorical to completely strip that base of its defenders. There's no real need to redeploy the naval units down here in Brisbane and Noumea because they're perfectly able to react from where they are. However, we have an awful lot of stuff at Pearl Harbor that could do with shifting. So I'll just bring it down here so I can look at it. Now we have air units, but it's starting to look a bit crowded in the Solomons for aircraft, so we'll leave Pearl Harbor's aircraft where they are for the moment. I don't think there's any great sense in bringing them down. I think we do want to move the 2nd Marine Division, if only so we can move the Army boys straight in after that. So the question is, where do we want to put the 2nd Marines? I mean, an obvious answer would be Guadalcanal if we wanted to feel really mean to the Japanese and make the place impregnable. Maybe somewhere within striking distance of Japanese possessions to get them worried. I think maybe not at Guadalcanal itself, but somewhere close by. Espiritu Santo would be a good shout. Plus it's fairly out of range of Japanese interference. So looking at the distance, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 for the first leg of their journey. Then 1, 2, 3, okay. So to bring the 2nd Marine Division there would cost the US another 4 transport points. And lastly, we probably better save some of this for the naval units. Now, looking at what the US has, they've got a substantial number of destroyers. And I'm just going to look at some of their heavier units. So the US have 6 destroyer counters at Pearl, 1 set of AA cruisers, 2 heavy cruiser counters, and the all-important carriers and some of the newly minted battleships. So I think because the carriers are so vital, I'm going to give them an escort of AA cruisers and 2 destroyer counters. And I will send... Are we ready to send battleships into the theatre? Yes, we are. So I think a battleship accompanied by 1 of the heavy cruiser counters and 2 destroyer counters to fill out the mix for that task force. Now let me see how much this is going to cost me in transport points, because it's going to be a lot. So let's see, 2, 3, 4 for the carrier task force. So again, and I think we will send them to Espiritu Santo. Oh no, we won't, because its base capacity is terrible. We'll send them down to Numea. So 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So that's going to cost us a fair bit of fuel. Or transport costs, I should say. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So, ooh, that's 8 transport points. I think the battleships are actually going to remain at Pearl this turn. I'll just make sure I haven't overloaded the base. I don't think I have, no. So we've got 5.5 points in Numea. It's a shame about the battleship. I was really hoping to move them down this turn, but I don't think the US transport capacity is going to cope with that. So I will leave my powerful battleship force at Pearl for now. And also, excuse me, also the remaining units. The carriers will just have to hold the line for the moment. So there we go. There's our first deployment. What about operational movement? Now, thinking about this logically, the US actually have the Japanese exactly where they want them, because they are in a position to turn Guadalcanal into what has often been described as a sinkhole for Japanese air and possibly naval power as well. By holding on to Guadalcanal, the US has 15 victory points there and another 10 for Port Moresby. So they've really got nothing to worry about, and they don't actually need to conduct any attacks this turn. Now, the great temptation is to just sit back and let the Japanese make a move, because although it will deprive the US Navy of some of its agency and ability to free roam, if they don't launch any attacks or make any operational moves with their naval units, certainly, it means they will be available next turn when the Japanese come back and inevitably try to take Guadalcanal, because they've got no choice. They've got to do it. And the same with the air assets. Because of the distances, these guys will be halving their strength if the Allies go on the offensive. Whereas if they sit there, they'll be defending at full strength, which is a much better proposition. Probably a better chance of blunting the Japanese attacks. It may sound a bit boring, but I think it's strategically sound. So this time, the United States is not going to do anything. They're just going to hang on to what they've got. The Japanese obviously don't react because there's no operational movement. Although that said, do I want to bomb the Japanese? Maybe I do. Maybe it's time to start a campaign of aerial attrition after all. So yes, let's go for it. So the aircraft at Port Moresby and at Guadalcanal are both going to launch an attritional air attack on the Japanese based at Rabaul. So let's see how this goes. So we have the 4 air points at the base at Rabaul, and we have a total of 6 Allied air points, but they're long-range air, so it's going to be halved to 3. going to be a fairly close tussle as these things go. So the first thing that'll happen will be the air superiority rolls. Oh, and the Allies have done very well. They've scored 3 hits to the Japanese 1. So both sides are weaker, but the US, just for form's sake, have air superiority, however temporary that may be. So they are going to make their attacks. The Japanese actually can't do anything with that air point because there's no legitimate target for them to attack. They'd only put them up as combat air patrol, and they've already done that. The US are going to focus both their air points on bombing Japanese air forces at the base. But before they do that, I'm just going to move that back up there. Rabaul gets to chuck some anti-aircraft fire at them. So the Japanese open fire, but they do not get any hits. Luck is with the Allied airmen so far. So the 2 Allied strength points will come in for their attack runs. It's a pity they don't have air supremacy, but there we go. And they score 1 hit. That's not bad. So Japanese strength at the base is reduced by 1 air point. That was worth doing. And so we return everyone to where they came from. And the stage is set, hopefully, now that we've all returned to base, for an equally satisfying second turn for the US. Now, it's the second deployment opportunity, and there are a few units I would have liked to have shuffled round, but with only 2 transport points left, it doesn't really seem worth doing that. There's nobody I want to move from Pearl Harbor, except that I want to move that large US Army unit to Pearl Harbor, but there aren't enough transport points for that yet. So I think we are going to have to, we'll have to wait for the next turn on that one. And so finally, that's the end of the turn. It was a rather quick Allied turn, mainly because I'd decided to be a bit passive on the naval and ground fronts. But I think in terms of defending Guadalcanal, this is the best way forward for the Allies at the moment. They don't want to keep sending their fleets, as I say, on offensive missions, because while that's great, and while you can sometimes get good results doing that, you then inevitably send them back to their home port once they've shot their bolt. And because they've taken part in an operation, you then can't move them again during the second deployment phase. So from the US's perspective, it's far better to have them on station and ready to react to anything the Japanese might do. So I think I was going to press on and move into the Japanese turn, but I might just keep this video slightly shorter because I like the pattern that this is developing into, where I do a video for the Japanese half of a turn and then a video for an Allied half of the turn. So I will stop there because that concludes the first turn of the campaign, and we will now be moving into the October to December 1942 phase. So yes, we will next see what the Japanese decide to do, to see if they can chuck out the insolent Americans who have snipped off their outpost at the bottom end of the Solomon Islands chain. So leaving it there then, I will thank you all again for following this series. Yes, it's been a bit of a shorter video because of the relative lack of combat, but as the Japanese rouse themselves for another effort in the coming turn, I'm sure that we'll be seeing a lot more action on land, on sea, and in the air. But in the meantime, thank you so much for following the series, for continuing to follow it. As always, I really appreciate your company. To my grizzled veterans, hello to all of you. And again, thank you to all of you who've left me messages. I will crack on tomorrow and try and get some of those answered, if not all of them. And I will hopefully, if the general situation permits, maybe even get the next video cranked out tomorrow as well. So, yeah, thank you, veterans. And to anyone new, as always, if this is the first of my videos you're watching, a very warm welcome to the channel. I hope you've enjoyed what you've seen. If it's fire in the sky that's led you over here, I'm really glad to hear that. I love this game. Please do look at the other videos I've made relating to it. Or if it's wargaming in general, please feel free to meander around the channel. I hope you find something else that you like as well. But as always, whoever you are, wherever you're watching from, really appreciate your company and the time you've committed to watching these. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Take care. Bye.